Dot.
George. George. God. George.
Look out at the water.
George.
Hustle hard.
George. God. George. Dottie. Franz. George.
Saraz. George. Harriet Pauling.
Billy Webster.
George.
George.
Charles Redmond.
George Randolph.
Lee Randolph.
Dot.
George. Naomi.
Dennis.
George. George.
Oh, Redmond. Alex. Blair.
George.
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 Be George.
Henry.
George. Marie. Charles. Marie. Charles. Marie. Charles. George. Marie. George. Marie. George. Marie. George. Do not know. Dot.
George.
Dot. George.